The blizzard howled mercilessly that night, burying the remote Montana countryside under sheets of blinding white. Only two sounds cut through the storm's fury: the labored breathing of retired police captain Michael Donovan as he struggled to maneuver his wheelchair through the deepening snow, and the faint, desperate whimper coming from somewhere in the abandoned property he'd been warned never to approach. What he discovered there, a once proud police canine German shepherd chained to a rusted pipe, half-starved and left to die, would forge an unlikely alliance between two broken warriors that would eventually save not just each other, but dozens of forgotten heroes across the country. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bitter January. Wind cut through Michael Donovan's layers as if they were tissue paper, but the 68-year-old barely noticed anymore. 3 years after the shooting that had severed his spinal cord and ended his 4-decade career in law enforcement, physical discomfort had become background noise, just another daily reminder of everything he'd lost. His custom-built cabin sat on the outskirts of White Ridge, Montana, a town small enough that everyone knew his story, but remote enough that he could avoid their pitying glances most days. The property backed up against national forest land, providing the isolation he'd come to prefer since the incident. Michael's morning routine rarely varied: coffee at dawn, exercises prescribed by the physical therapist he no longer visited, and then a patrol of his property in his all-terrain wheelchair, a final gift from his department before they'd essentially forgotten him. The chair's thick treads handled the rugged terrain reasonably well, even in winter, giving him one small piece of independence he guarded fiercely. This morning, however, something disrupted the pattern. As he reached the northern boundary of his land, where his property met the abandoned Henderson place, Michael heard something carried on the wind, faint but unmistakable. A whimper, then a weak, raspy bark. Michael stopped, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The Henderson property had been vacant for nearly 2 years, ever since the old man died and his city-dwelling children listed it for a price no local could afford. There shouldn't be anything or anyone over there. The sound came again, more desperate this time. Michael hesitated. The boundary between the properties was marked by a line of weathered fence posts, many now leaning. From years of harsh Montana winters, he'd never trespassed before, respecting property lines as automatically as he'd once respected the law he'd sworn to uphold. But that sound. 20 years as a K-9 officer had attuned his ears to the distress calls of dogs. Before the shooting, he and his partner Kaiser had been inseparable, the most decorated K-9 team in department history. Kaiser had been retired to live with Michael after the incident, only to die peacefully in his sleep 6 months later, leaving Michael truly alone. The memory of Kaiser seemed to push Michael forward. He maneuvered his wheelchair through a gap in the fence posts, the treads struggling against the accumulated snow. The Henderson house loomed ahead, windows dark and empty, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The sound grew louder as Michael approached the detached garage behind the main house. Its door hung partially open, creaking in the wind. Michael pushed closer, his wheels leaving parallel tracks in the fresh snow. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the winter stillness. "Anyone there?" No human response came, but the whimpering intensified, followed by the faint clink of metal against concrete. Michael pushed his chair forward, squeezing through the gap in the garage door. The interior was dim, illuminated only by weak winter light filtering through grimy windows. The air smelled of motor oil, mildew, and something worse, the unmistakable scent of an animal in distress. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, Michael saw him. In the far corner lay a German shepherd, so thin his ribs protruded like barrel staves beneath his dull coat. A heavy chain ran from a thick metal collar to a pipe along the wall, offering barely enough length for the dog to stand. An overturned bowl lay just out of reach, bone dry. Patches of fur were missing, revealing skin rubbed raw by the cruel collar. But what struck Michael most were the dog's eyes, amber like Kaiser's had been, and filled with a silent understanding that his situation was dire. Those eyes locked onto Michael's with an intelligence that seemed to transcend species. Michael felt something crack inside him, a wall of emotional numbness he'd carefully constructed over the past 3 years. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, wheeling closer. The dog's tail thumped weakly against the concrete floor, a gesture of hope that nearly broke Michael's heart. As a former K9 officer, the sight of a police dog, for the German Shepherd's bearing, and small half-hidden tattoo in his ear marked him unmistakably as one. Treated this way filled him with cold fury. "Who did this to you, boy?" Michael murmured, reaching out slowly. The dog didn't growl or shrink away. Instead, he stretched his neck toward Michael's outstretched fingers, his dry nose seeking contact. The simple gesture of trust from an animal, who had every reason to fear humans, undid something in Michael's carefully controlled demeanor. The chain was secured with a heavy padlock. Michael tugged at it fruitlessly, then examined the pipe where it was anchored. Years of exposure to moisture had corroded the metal fitting. With enough leverage, it might give way. "I'll be back," Michael promised, already turning his chair toward the exit. "You hear me? I'm coming back." The dog watched him leave, those intelligent eyes following his movements until he disappeared from view. Michael pushed his wheelchair harder than he had in months, breath coming in sharp bursts as he crossed the boundary back to his property. Inside his workshop, he grabbed a crowbar, bolt cutters, a thermos of water and some leftover venison from his dinner the night before. He stuffed everything into a backpack and hung it on the handles of his chair. The return journey seemed to take an eternity. By the time Michael reached the garage again, sweat had soaked through his thermal shirt, despite the cold, and his arms burned from the exertion of powering through the deepening snow. The dog lifted his head when Michael entered, that same tail, offering a weak thump of welcome. "I told you I'd be back," Michael said, moving closer. He offered the water first, holding the thermos cap while the dog drank greedily. Next came small pieces of venison, which disappeared instantly. Michael knew better than to offer too much at once to a starved animal, so he tucked the remaining food away. Then he turned his attention to the chain. The bolt cutters proved useless against the heavy links, just as he'd suspected. Instead, Michael wedged the crowbar between the pipe and the wall fitting, using his considerable upper body strength, maintained through years of navigating life in a wheelchair, to apply pressure. For several moments, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of protesting metal, the pipe shifted. Michael adjusted his grip and pulled again, ignoring the strain in his shoulders and back. This time, the fitting gave way completely, the pipe tearing free from the wall with a shower of rust and crumbling concrete. The dog was still chained, but now the chain was attached only to the loose pipe rather than the wall. It would have to do for now. "Come on, boy," Michael said softly. "Let's get you out of here." The dog struggled to stand, legs weak from confinement and malnutrition. When he finally managed it, his shoulders barely reached Michael's waist, far too thin for a full-grown shepherd. Slowly, they made their way out of the garage, the dog dragging the length of chain and pipe behind him. The journey back to Michael's cabin was painfully slow. Every few yards, the dog needed to rest, and the chain repeatedly caught on obstacles, hidden beneath the snow. But the animal never whined, never complained. He simply pushed forward with a determination that Michael recognized all too well. By the time they reached the cabin, darkness had begun to fall, and the temperature had dropped further. Michael helped the dog up the wheelchair ramp to his porch, then through the door into the warm interior. Inside, under proper light, the dog's condition appeared even worse. Besides being severely underweight, he had infected sores where the collar had rubbed his neck raw and old scars that spoke of previous mistreatment. Yet there was an unmistakable dignity in the way he carried himself, the bearing of a working dog who remembered his purpose. Using heavy-duty wire cutters from his tool drawer, Michael managed to sever one link of the chain, freeing the dog from the dragging pipe, though the heavy collar remained. "That'll have to wait until we can get you to a vet," Michael told him, "but at least you're mobile now." He prepared a bed near the fireplace using old blankets, then offered more water and a little more food. The dog accepted both gratefully, then settled onto the makeshift bed with a deep sigh. Michael watched him for a long moment, emotions he'd thought long buried rising to the surface. "What's your story?" he asked quietly. "Who trained you, then threw you away?" The dog's eyes remained fixed on Michael, as if trying to communicate across the impossible divide between their species. In that steady gaze, Michael saw something he recognized, the look of someone who had endured darkness but hadn't surrendered to it. For the first time in 3 years, Michael Donovan felt something stir within him that he'd thought permanently extinguished. Purpose. "You're safe now," he told the dog, surprised to hear his voice crack. "We'll figure this out together." As if understanding, the German shepherd lowered his head onto his paws, eyes still watching Michael. But the tension had left his body, replaced by something that looked remarkably like trust. Outside, snow continued to fall, erasing their tracks and wrapping the cabin in pristine white. Inside, 2 broken warriors had found each other, neither yet understanding how completely this chance encounter would transform both their lives. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morning brought clarity and complications in equal measure. Michael awoke early, his body stiff from falling asleep in his wheelchair rather than transferring to his bed. He'd been unwilling to leave the rescued dog alone. During that first uncertain night, the German shepherd was already awake, watching him with those intelligent amber eyes. The dog had barely moved from his spot by the fireplace, as if afraid that making himself too noticeable might result in being cast out into the cold again. "First order of business," Michael said, his voice rough with sleep, "is getting that collar off and having you checked out." He reached for his phone and hesitated. The local veterinarian, Dr. Santos, was competent but talkative. Once word got out that former police captain Donovan had rescued an abandoned K9, the questions would begin. The unwanted attention, the town's renewed interest in his life. Michael had carefully cultivated his isolation over the past 3 years. After the shooting that left him paralyzed from the waist down, he'd endured months of well-meaning visits, casseroles delivered with pitying smiles, and former colleagues who grew increasingly uncomfortable in his presence. Eventually, he'd made it clear that he preferred solitude, and the town had gradually complied, leaving him to his self-imposed exile. This dog would change all that. For a moment, Michael considered his options. He could drive the animal to the next county over, where nobody knew him. He could claim he'd found the dog wandering and plan to find its owner. He could maintain his carefully constructed walls. Then the shepherd struggled to his feet, wincing as the movement pulled at the raw skin around his neck, and limped over to where Michael sat. Without hesitation, he rested his head on Michael's knee, those amber eyes looking up with complete trust. Michael's hand moved automatically to the dog's head, fingers gently stroking the matted fur. "Seems we're in this together now," he murmured. 30 minutes later, they were in Michael's adapted truck, headed toward town. The dog sat in the passenger seat, still wearing the cruel collar, but now connected to a proper leash Michael had kept from Kaiser's days. The shepherd watched the passing landscape with alert interest, occasionally turning to check on Michael as if assuring himself his rescuer was still there. Dr. Santos's small veterinary clinic sat on the edge of Whiteridge, a modest building with a gravel parking lot, currently empty of other vehicles. Michael had called ahead, explaining he needed a private appointment before regular hours. He'd been deliberately vague about the details. The young veterinarian was waiting at the door when Michael parked. Her eyes widened as she took in the German Shepherd's condition, professional composure momentarily slipping. "Bring him straight to exam room 1, she said, holding the door as Michael transferred into his wheelchair and guided the dog inside. Under the bright lights of the examination room, the full extent of the shepherd's condition became painfully clear. Dr. Santos worked methodically, first sedating the dog to remove the heavy collar, then cleaning and treating the infected wounds, around his neck and elsewhere on his body. "Where did you find him?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral as she worked. "Henderson Place," Michael replied, seeing no point in lying. "Chained in the garage. Don't know how long he'd been there." Dr. Santos nodded, focusing on cleaning a particularly nasty wound. "He's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and has numerous infections, but his blood work could be worse. What's most concerning is this." She gently rolled the sedated dog to reveal a poorly healed wound on his right flank. "Gunshot. Not recent, but not properly treated either." Michael's jaw tightened. "He's a K9, isn't he?" The vet nodded again. "The tattoo in his ear confirms it. Department identification number, though not from around here." She hesitated, then asked, "Are you planning to keep him?" The question caught Michael off guard. He hadn't thought beyond getting the dog immediate help. "He'll need consistent care," Dr. Santos continued, not waiting for an answer. "Special diet to begin with, medication for the infections, physical therapy eventually to rebuild muscle. And that's just the physical aspects. Psychologically, well, you know better than most what these working dogs are capable of, and what happens when they're abandoned." Michael did know. During his years as a K9 officer, he'd seen police dogs form bonds so powerful with their handlers that separation could cause profound depression in both human and animal. For a trained K9 to end up chained and abandoned spoke of a severe betrayal. "Of that sacred partnership, I'll take care of him," Michael said, the decision crystallizing even as he spoke the words. Dr. Santos studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll put together everything you'll need for his initial recovery. And Captain Donovan, it's good to see you in town again." 2 hours later, Michael's truck was loaded with medications, special food, bandages, and instructions. The dog, now awake from sedation and sporting proper bandages where the collar had been, seemed more alert already, watching everything with increased awareness. As Michael prepared to leave, Dr. Santos handed him one more thing, a small device with a screen. "I scanned him for a microchip, found one." She showed Michael the information displayed. "His name is Sentinel. He's 5 years old. Trained by North Star Canine Academy in Colorado, then sold to a department in Wyoming. That's all the chip tells us." "Sentinel," Michael repeated, glancing at the dog, who perked up at the name. "If you want to know more about how he ended up chained in an abandoned garage in Montana, you could contact the academy or the department," Dr. Santos suggested. "They might want him back." Michael looked at Sentinel, sitting calmly in the passenger seat of his truck, waiting patiently despite all he'd endured. "We'll see," was all he said. The drive home was quiet, both man and dog lost in their own thoughts. Once back at the cabin, Michael established a recovery area for Sentinel, a comfortable bed near the fireplace, easily accessible water, and a quiet space where he could rest undisturbed. That evening, after Sentinel had eaten a careful portion of his prescribed diet and taken his medications, Michael found himself sitting in his wheelchair next to the dog's bed, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Sentinel," he said, testing the name again. The dog lifted his head, ears forward with interest. "Who abandoned you, boy, and why?" Sentinel just watched him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. Michael took a sip of whiskey, feeling the familiar burn. Before his injury, he'd rarely drunk alcohol. After, it had become a nightly ritual, not enough to truly dull the pain, just enough to blur the edges of his isolation. Tonight, for the first time in years, the glass remained mostly full as the hours passed. Michael found himself talking to Sentinel instead, first about inconsequential things, the weather, the repairs the cabin needed, the deer that sometimes ventured close to the porch. Gradually, though, the words shifted to matters he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. 3 years, he told the silently attentive dog. 3 years since a drug dealer with a grudge and a semi-automatic changed everything. You know what the worst part is? It wasn't even about me. Just wrong place, wrong time. 4 decades of service. And it ends because some kid with a gun didn't. Like that I'd arrested his brother the year before. Sentinel watched, his eyes never leaving Michael's face. I pushed everyone away after. Colleagues, friends, even family. Couldn't stand the pity, the awkward conversations, the way they'd look at the chair instead of at me. Michael swirled the whiskey in his glass. Easier to be alone than to be a reminder of what can go wrong on the job. The confession hung in the air between them. After a moment, Sentinel struggled to his feet, still weak but determined, and moved the short distance to Michael's chair. He rested his head on Michael's knee, just as he had that morning. Michael's throat tightened unexpectedly. He set the whiskey aside and placed his hand on Sentinel's head. "Guess neither of us is very good at giving up, huh?" That night, for the first time since his injury, Michael dreamed not of the shooting that had taken his mobility, but of running through mountain forests alongside a healthy, strong Sentinel. The dream was so vivid that when he woke, the phantom, sensation of movement in his legs, lingered for several heartbeats before reality reasserted itself. But unlike most mornings, the crushing disappointment didn't follow. Instead, Michael found himself looking over at Sentinel, still sleeping peacefully by the fireplace, and feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it for what it was. Purpose. With methodical precision, born from years of police work, Michael reached for his laptop. Before beginning Sentinel's morning care routine, he had research to do. Finding out how a trained police K9 had ended up abandoned and left to die would require detective skills he hadn't used in years. As the laptop booted up, Michael glanced again at Sentinel, who had awoken and was watching him with that steady gaze. "Don't worry, boy," Michael said quietly. "We're going to figure out what happened to you, and then we're going to make it right." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, as if sealing a pact between them. Outside, the Montana winter continued its assault on the isolated cabin, wind howling around the eaves and snow piling against the windows. But inside, the penetrating cold of emptiness that had defined Michael Donovan's existence for 3 years had begun, almost imperceptibly, to thaw. The following weeks established a rhythm to Michael and Sentinel's days, centered around the dog's recovery. Each morning began with medication, gentle cleaning of wounds, and careful monitoring of the K9's improving condition. Dr. Santos had provided a detailed rehabilitation plan, which Michael followed with military precision, tracking every small improvement in a notebook he kept beside Sentinel's bed. Physical progress came slowly but steadily. The infected wounds began to heal, patches of missing fur showed signs of regrowth, and Sentinel gradually put on weight. His energy improved in small increments, first standing for longer periods, then walking the length of the cabin without, resting and eventually making brief excursions onto the porch to sniff the crisp winter air. What surprised Michael most was how the dog's presence altered his own habits. The whiskey bottle remained mostly untouched in the cabinet. His sleep, chronically disturbed since the shooting, deepened and lengthened. He began rising earlier, cooking proper meals instead of subsisting on coffee and whatever required minimal preparation. The cabin, long maintained with just enough effort to remain functional, received renewed attention. Floors swept, surfaces cleared, windows washed to allow more light inside. These changes happened almost unconsciously, as if Sentinel's need for stability and care had awakened something dormant in Michael, a capacity for attention to life's details that he'd abandoned along with his badge. Meanwhile, Michael's investigation into Sentinel's background proceeded with methodical determination. His initial calls to North Star K9 Academy had yielded little information beyond confirmation that they had indeed trained a German shepherd named Sentinel 4 years ago, selling him to the Blackwater County Sheriff's Department in Wyoming. The Academy representative had been polite but cautious, citing confidentiality protocols. The Blackwater County Sheriff's Office proved more difficult to penetrate. Multiple calls resulted in being transferred between departments, left on hold, or promised return calls that never materialized. Michael recognized the bureaucratic stonewalling for what it was. Someone didn't want to discuss what had happened to one of their K9 officers. On a particularly cold Tuesday morning, as January gave way to February, Michael decided to change tactics. After settling Sentinel with fresh water and his morning medication, he rolled his wheelchair to the spare bedroom that had once served as Kaiser's training space and storage for Michael's police memorabilia. The room had remained closed since Kaiser's death, preserving the particular grief associated with losing his K9 partner like insects trapped in amber. Michael paused at the threshold, hand on the doorknob, memories washing over him. Finally, with a deep breath, he pushed the door open and entered. The room smelled of dust and disuse. Cardboard boxes lined one wall containing equipment, awards, and mementos from his police career. A specially designed cabinet held Kaiser's training tools, vest, and ceremonial collar. On the wall hung framed certificates, newspaper clippings, and photographs documenting 4 decades of service. Michael moved to a box labeled Contacts and began searching through old notebooks and directories. After 20 minutes, he found what he was looking for, a small black address book containing contact information for police officers and K9 handlers he'd met at regional training conferences. He might have retired and withdrawn from the law enforcement community, but somewhere in this network, someone would talk to him about Blackwater County. He pulled out his phone and began making calls. It took 11 attempts before he found a promising lead. Steve Ramirez, a retired K9 trainer from Colorado, whom Michael had met at a conference 6 years earlier, answered on the 3rd ring. Donovan? Michael Donovan from Montana? Christ, I thought you'd dropped off the face of the earth. Nearly did, Michael replied, the social muscles of conversation feeling stiff from disuse. I need information, Steve, about a K9 from Blackwater County, Wyoming, German shepherd named Sentinel. There was a pause on the line. Why are you asking? Michael explained the discovery at the Henderson property, Sentinel's condition, and the stonewalling from the sheriff's department. As he spoke, he could hear his voice gaining strength and clarity, the investigative tone returning naturally after years of silence. That's, unusual, Steve said when Michael finished. Blackwater has a solid K9 program. Not the biggest, but professional. Handler named Marcus Ellington ran it for years. Any controversies? Budget cuts, personnel changes. Another pause. There was something. About a year ago. Nothing official, just rumbles through the grapevine. New sheriff elected, bringing his own people in. Some program changes. I heard Ellington retired suddenly, which surprised people. He was only mid-50s. Michael made notes as Steve spoke. Any idea who would know more? Ellington himself. It would, obviously, but I don't have current contact information. There's a dispatcher at Blackwater named Fran Mueller. Been there forever, knows everything that happens in that department. If anyone would talk, it might be her. After thanking Steve and jotting down Fran Mueller's contact information, Michael ended the call and sat for a moment, contemplating his next move. The dispatcher might be more forthcoming if he approached in person rather than over the phone, but Blackwater County was at least a 7-hour drive from Whiteridge, and winter road conditions would make it longer. The sound of nails clicking on hardwood interrupted his thoughts. Sentinel appeared in the doorway, moving more steadily than he had just days earlier. The dog paused, surveying the long-closed room with evident curiosity. "Just doing some research, boy," Michael explained, watching as Sentinel cautiously entered the space, nose working as he catalogued the many scents preserved within. The German shepherd moved methodically around the room, investigating each corner and container. When he reached the cabinet containing Kaiser's belongings, he stopped, head lifting as he caught the scent of another K9. He looked back at Michael, head tilted questioningly. "That was Kaiser," Michael said softly. "My partner." Sentinel approached the cabinet, sniffing intently at its base, then sat down facing it, as if paying respects. The simple gesture caught Michael off guard, touching something deep within him that had remained carefully walled off for years. For the first time since Kaiser's death, Michael opened the cabinet. Inside, Kaiser's service vest hung neatly preserved, the specially designed K9 badge still attached. Below it sat his training equipment, leashes, and the ceremonial collar he'd worn during his retirement ceremony. Michael reached in and removed the leather collar, running his fingers over the engraved nameplate. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he turned to Sentinel. "You need a proper collar now that you're healing," he said, "until we get you one of your own. Would you mind borrowing this?" He held out Kaiser's collar. Sentinel sniffed it carefully, then lowered his head, allowing Michael to slip it. Around his neck, the collar was a bit loose. Sentinel was still underweight compared to Kaiser's robust build, but it looked right somehow, a passing of the torch from one K9 to another. "There," Michael said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Looks good on you." Sentinel straightened, seeming to sense the significance of the moment. He stood taller, his bearing shifting subtly, less the wounded stray and more the trained police dog he had once been. Michael cleared his throat. "We've got work to do, Sentinel. Something happened at Blackwater County, and it led to you being abandoned. I need to find out what, and that means a road trip." As if understanding every word, Sentinel's ears perked forward attentively. Planning the journey required considerations Michael hadn't faced in years. He needed to ensure his adapted truck was winter-ready for mountain driving and pack proper emergency supplies. Sentinel would need his medications, special food, and comfortable bedding. The trip would require at least one overnight stay, possibly more depending on what they discovered. Michael made a detailed list, methodically checking off items as he gathered them. By late afternoon, most preparations were complete. There remained only the question of lodging, finding a motel that would accept a dog while also accommodating his own accessibility needs. As he researched options online, Michael realized something that stopped him mid-keystroke. For 3 years, he had barely left his property except for essential errands. The thought of traveling across state lines, staying in unfamiliar places, and confronting strangers would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. Yet here he was, planning exactly that without hesitation. He glanced at Sentinel, who had settled near his wheelchair, dozing lightly but remaining within arm's reach, as had become his habit. "You're changing me, boy," Michael murmured. "Not sure how I feel about that yet." That evening, Michael called Dr. Santos to inform her of their planned departure the following morning. Her response surprised him. "I think it's a good idea for both of you," she said. "Sentinel's physically stable enough for travel, and getting answers might help his psychological recovery. As for you—" She hesitated. "What about me?" Michael asked, a defensive edge creeping into his voice. "Captain Donovan, in the 3 years since your injury, this is the first time you've mentioned leaving town, let alone embarking on an investigative mission. That's significant progress, whether you recognize it or not." Michael was silent for a moment, uncomfortable with her assessment yet unable to refute it. "We'll check in when we return," he said finally. "I look forward to hearing what you discover," Dr. Santos replied. "Safe travels." That night Michael slept poorly, his mind cycling through all the potential complications of the journey ahead. What if Sentinel's condition worsened on the road? What if they encountered accessibility issues Michael couldn't overcome? What if they traveled all that way only to meet another wall of silence? Yet beneath these practical concerns lay a deeper anxiety. For the first time in 3 years, Michael Donovan was stepping back into the world that had continued without him. He was taking action, asking questions, demanding answers, reclaiming parts of himself that had been buried alongside his mobility. The realization was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. As dawn broke, Michael transferred from bed to wheelchair with practiced efficiency and moved to where Sentinel lay sleeping. At Michael's approach, the dog's eyes opened immediately, alert and watchful. "Ready for a road trip, partner?" Michael asked. Sentinel stood, stretching carefully to avoid pulling at healing wounds, then moved to Michael's side, leaning slightly against the wheelchair in what had become his customary position of companionship. Together, they faced the doorway, the threshold, between isolation and engagement, between passive acceptance and active pursuit of truth. The path ahead contained unknowns and difficulties, but for the first time since bullets had torn through his spine, Michael Donovan felt the quiet certainty that had once defined his law enforcement career. Whatever had happened to Sentinel, whatever corruption or negligence had led to his abandonment, would not remain hidden. Michael would see justice done, not as a sworn officer of the law, but simply as a man who understood the sacred bond between handler and K9, and who refused to let its violations stand unanswered. As they moved toward the door, Michael realized that in seeking to save Sentinel, he might have actually taken the first steps toward saving himself. The Montana sunrise painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of amber, and rose as Michael's adapted truck pulled away from the cabin. Sentinel sat in the passenger seat, Kaiser's collar gleaming against his improving coat, his alert gaze fixed on the road ahead. The first leg of their journey would take them southeast through Montana's mountain passes before crossing into Wyoming, approximately 7 hours under ideal conditions, likely longer given the winter roads. Michael had loaded the truck meticulously, wheelchair secured in the specialized rack behind the driver's seat, emergency supplies stored in waterproof containers, medications organized in a tackle box for easy access, and enough food for both of them to last several days. Years of police work had instilled in him the habit of thorough preparation, a skill set that remained intact despite his long isolation. As they left the familiar surroundings of White Ridge behind, Michael felt a peculiar sensation, something between anxiety and exhilaration. The boundaries of his world, so carefully maintained since his injury, were expanding with each mile. Occasionally, he glanced at Sentinel, drawing reassurance from the dog's calm, dignified presence. "First road trip in 3 years, Michael," told him as they passed the county line. "For me, anyway. You must have traveled plenty before." He let the sentence trail off, not wanting to remind Sentinel of whatever trauma had led to his abandonment. The dog seemed to understand, turning to meet Michael's gaze briefly before returning his attention to the passing landscape. The morning hours passed uneventfully as they navigated rural highways. Around noon, Michael pulled into a rest area to administer Sentinel's medication and stretch as much as his condition allowed. The dog moved more confidently now, circling the truck with interest, though he never strayed far from Michael's side. As Michael maneuvered back into the driver's seat, his phone rang, Dr. Santos checking on their progress. He updated her on Sentinel's condition and estimated their arrival in Blackwater County by early evening. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said. "If you do locate Sentinel's previous handler, are you prepared for the possibility they might want him back?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Michael's consciousness. He hadn't allowed himself to consider that outcome. "If they abandoned him to die chained in a garage," he replied, his voice hard, "they forfeited any right to him." "I agree," Dr. Santos said quickly, "but legally—" "I know the legal considerations," Michael interrupted. "Let's cross that bridge if we come to it." After ending the call, Michael sat motionless, hand resting on Sentinel's head. The possibility of losing the dog to his former handler hadn't factored into his calculations. Sentinel had become, in just a few short weeks, the anchor point around which Michael's days revolved. The thought of returning to solitude sent a cold wave of dread through him. "We'll figure it out," he told Sentinel, who leaned against his arm in silent support. "Right now, let's focus on finding answers." They continued south, the landscape changing as they descended from Montana's higher elevations into the rolling hills of northern Wyoming. By mid-afternoon, heavy clouds had gathered and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Michael increased their stopping frequency, unwilling to risk road conditions deteriorating, while Sentinel was overdue for medication. During one such stop, as Michael administered the antibiotics for Sentinel's healing wounds, he noticed something unusual. The dog had positioned himself between Michael and an approaching vehicle, his posture subtly shifting to a more alert stance. When a man emerged from the car and walked toward the restroom facilities, Sentinel's eyes tracked him continuously until he disappeared inside. "You still remember your training," Michael observed quietly. When they returned to the road, the snow intensified. Michael reduced their speed, hands gripping the wheel with renewed concentration. Visibility decreased steadily until the world beyond the windshield became a swirling grey void, with only occasional glimpses of the highway ahead. "Might need to stop for the night sooner than planned," Michael muttered, squinting through the windshield. "This is getting dangerous." As if in confirmation, his phone chimed with a weather alert. Winter storm warning, hazardous driving conditions, travel not advised. Michael sighed and began looking for exit signs, indicating accommodations. They were still 20 miles from the next town when disaster struck. A patch of black ice, invisible beneath the fresh snow, sent the truck into a skid. Michael reacted instinctively, steering into the slide, but the physics of ice and momentum prevailed. The truck slid sideways toward the shoulder, where it dropped, into a drainage ditch with a bone-jarring impact. For a moment, everything was silent except for the soft ticking of snow against the windshield. Michael took stock. He was uninjured, the airbags hadn't deployed, but the truck sat at an awkward angle, its front right wheel suspended above the ditch, while the left rear wheel spun uselessly in the air. "You okay, boy?" he asked Sentinel, who appeared shaken but unhurt. Michael tried to reverse out of the ditch, but the wheels found no purchase. They were stuck miles from town in deteriorating weather conditions. He reached for his phone to call for assistance, but the screen showed no signal, the storm interfering with reception. "Perfect," he muttered, frustration rising as he surveyed their predicament. The reality of their situation hit him with sudden clarity. A paralyzed man and a recovering dog, stranded in a snowstorm with limited visibility and no immediate communication options. If they remained in the truck, the gradually dropping temperature would become dangerous once the fuel, and thus the heater, ran out. If Michael attempted to seek help on his own, Sentinel would be left alone, and Michael's wheelchair would be nearly useless in deepening snow. For a brief, dark moment, Michael felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had defined his early days after the shooting. Then Sentinel nudged his hand, brown eyes focused intently on his face, as if sensing his distress. "You're right," Michael said, gathering himself. "No time for self-pity. We need solutions." He reached into the back seat for the emergency kit, retrieving reflective triangles to place on the road if visibility improved. As he considered their options, Sentinel suddenly became alert. Head turning toward the direction they had been traveling, ears forward. "What is it, boy?" The dog gave a soft woof, barely more than an exhalation, and kept his attention fixed ahead. Michael strained to see through the swirling snow, but detected nothing. Then faintly he heard it, the rumble of an engine approaching. "Good ears," he told Sentinel appreciatively. Michael fumbled for the hazard lights, then located the high-powered emergency flashlight from his kit. As the sound of the engine grew closer, he rolled down his window and extended the light, waving it in a deliberate pattern that any law enforcement or rescue personnel would recognize as a distress signal. Through the curtain of snow, headlights appeared, slowing as they approached the stranded truck. The vehicle, a large pickup with emergency lights mounted on the roof, pulled carefully to the side of the road ahead of them. A figure emerged, bundled against the weather, and approached cautiously. "You folks all right in there?" A woman's voice called. "We're uninjured," Michael replied, "but stuck solid." The figure moved closer, revealing a middle-aged woman in a sheriff's deputy uniform, partially covered by a heavy winter coat. Her flashlight beam swept over the truck, assessing the situation, then settled on Michael. "Captain Donovan?" she asked, surprise evident in her voice. Michael frowned, unable to place her through the snow and gathering darkness. "Do I know you?" She stepped closer, pushing back her hood slightly. "Deputy Rachel Kurtz. We met at the regional K-9 training. Conference in Billings must be. 7 years ago now, you gave a presentation on tracking techniques in wilderness conditions." Recognition dawned slowly. "Deputy Kurtz, Ravalli County, right?" She nodded, appearing both pleased and concerned. "Sir, what are you doing out here? In this weather? Word was you'd retired after." She gestured vaguely toward his seated position, clearly uncomfortable, mentioning his injury directly. "Long story," Michael replied. "Involves this fellow." He indicated Sentinel, who had been watching the exchange with alert interest. Deputy Kurtz's flashlight beam shifted to the German Shepherd, her eyes widening at the sight of his healing wounds and the K-9 collar. "That's not Kaiser," she said carefully. "No, this is Sentinel. I found him abandoned, left to die, chained in an empty building. We're on our way to Blackwater County to find out why." The deputy's expression changed, something like recognition flickering across her features. "Blackwater County, Wyoming. You know something," Michael said, his investigator's instincts immediately alert. Kurtz hesitated, then nodded. "Not here. Let me get you folks out of this ditch first. My cabin's about 4 miles ahead. You can warm up there while we wait for a tow." With expert precision, she attached a recovery strap between the vehicles and guided Michael through the extraction process. 10 minutes later, they were following her taillights through the storm, moving slowly but steadily toward shelter. Deputy's cabin proved to be a substantial log home set back from the highway, protected by a stand of pine trees that broke the wind's force. A covered carport provided welcome shelter as Michael transferred into his wheelchair, Sentinel moving stiffly beside him after the stressful drive. Inside, the home was warm and surprisingly spacious, with an open floor plan and wide doorways that allowed Michael's wheelchair to navigate easily. A black Labrador retriever rose from a bed near the fireplace, approaching with dignified curiosity. "This is Jackson," Deputy Kurtz explained. "Retired K9, bomb detection. He's 10 now, enjoying his golden years." The two dogs greeted each other with professional courtesy. A brief sniff, a subtle tail wag, no dominance displays. Sentinel appeared to recognize a fellow service dog, his posture showing respect for the older K9. As Deputy Kurtz prepared coffee and made a call to arrange for Michael's truck to be towed when weather permitted, Michael observed the numerous photographs and service commendations displayed on her walls. Many featured Jackson in his working vest, but others showed different dogs, a K9 team rather than just a single handler-dog partnership. "You train them," Michael realized aloud. When she returned with steaming mugs, "Yes," she confirmed. "After Jackson and I finished our active duty, I started a small training program, mostly for departments that can't afford the big academies but need quality K9s. She sat across from him, expression growing serious. "Now about Blackwater County." She sipped her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "About a year ago, a friend in Wyoming law enforcement mentioned some concerns about their K9 program. New sheriff came in, guy named Preston. Former military, very rigid ideas about how things should run. Started making changes, including to their K9 program." "What kind of changes?" Michael pressed. "The concerning kind, pushing dogs and handlers beyond reasonable limits, demanding the kind of absolute control over K9s that borders on abusive, the kind of training techniques most reputable programs abandoned decades ago." Michael felt a cold anger building. And Sentinel? Kurtz studied the German Shepherd, who had settled next to Michael's wheelchair. "I can't say for certain, but there were rumors that some of their K9s were retired under questionable circumstances. Dogs that didn't meet the new sheriff's standards, or whose handlers pushed back against the changes. Retired usually means adopted by the handler, or placed with a qualified family," Michael said, the implication clear in his tone. "Usually," she agreed grimly. "But if a dog was labeled as aggressive or unmanageable—" Michael's hand tightened around his mug. "They wouldn't need documentation for euthanasia." "Except Sentinel wasn't euthanized," Kurtz observed, watching the dog with professional assessment. "He shows signs of neglect and injury, but his behavior— this is a well-trained K9 who bonded appropriately with handlers. Whatever story they created about him being dangerous was fabricated." The revelation settled over Michael like a physical weight. Someone had deliberately abandoned Sentinel to die, creating a false narrative to justify his disappearance from the program. The cruelty and corruption implicit in such actions awakened something in Michael that had been dormant for 3 years, a fierce determination to see justice done. "I need to get to Blackwater County," he said firmly. Deputy Kurtz nodded. "The storm's expected to clear by morning. Your truck should be towed to Garnier's garage in Falcon Ridge by noon. They're good people. We'll fix it quickly." She hesitated, then added, "But before you go charging into Blackwater, you should know that Sheriff Preston has powerful connections in the state government. This won't be as simple as showing up and demanding answers. I've dealt with difficult officials before," Michael replied. "Not as a civilian in a wheelchair," she said bluntly. "I respect your abilities, Captain Donovan, but the playing field has changed. You'll need evidence, allies, and a strategy." The hard truth of her assessment cut through Michael's determination, forcing him to acknowledge the reality of his current position. He was no longer Captain Donovan with a badge and the authority it carried. He was a private citizen with limited mobility, pursuing a potentially dangerous investigation against people who had already demonstrated a willingness to abandon a police canine to a slow death. As if sensing his thoughts, Sentinel pressed closer against his leg, that steady presence that had become Michael's anchor over the past weeks. "You're right," Michael conceded. "I need more than just determination. Do you have suggestions?" Deputy Kurtz smiled slightly, relief evident in her expression. "As a matter of fact, I do. And it starts with Jackson's previous trainer, a man who happens to have extensive contacts throughout Wyoming law enforcement and who owes me several favors." For the first time since their accident, Michael felt a genuine sense of hope. What had seemed like a disaster, sliding off the road in a snowstorm, had unexpectedly connected them with exactly the ally they needed. "Sometimes what looks like misfortune is actually opportunity in disguise," Kurtz said, echoing his thoughts. "You finding Sentinel, getting stranded near my cabin. Maybe there's a purpose behind it all." Michael wasn't generally inclined towards such philosophical perspectives, but looking at Sentinel, rescued from certain death, now potentially the key to exposing corruption, he couldn't entirely dismiss the notion. "Maybe," he acknowledged, "or maybe it's just what happens when good people refuse to look away from wrongdoing." Kurtz raised her mug in a small salute to refusing to look away then. As the storm raged outside, Michael Donovan found himself facing a new reality. What had begun as a simple mission to discover Sentinel's past had evolved into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Yet rather than feeling overwhelmed, he felt oddly energized, more focused and purposeful than he had since the shooting that had altered his life's trajectory. In seeking justice for Sentinel, he was reclaiming parts of himself he had believed permanently lost. The investigator, the advocate, the man who stood between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. And in this unexpected shelter from the storm, he had discovered something else, that his wheelchair didn't render him powerless or irrelevant. It simply meant he needed different strategies, different allies, adaptation rather than surrender. Sentinel yawned and settled his head on Michael's knee, eyes closing in well-earned rest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in the warmth of Deputy Kurtz's cabin, they had found not just physical shelter, but something more valuable. A path forward, illuminated by unexpected connections and renewed purpose. Morning arrived with clearing skies and a transformed landscape. The storm had buried Deputy Kurtz's property under nearly a foot of pristine snow, but brilliant sunshine now glinted off the white expanse, creating a postcard-perfect winter scene. Michael woke earlier than usual, his body stiff from sleeping, on the deputy's fold-out couch, but his mind surprisingly clear and focused. Sentinel had already risen and stood by the large picture window, his improving profile silhouetted against the brightness outside. The dog's ears perked forward at Michael's movement, and he turned to acknowledge his new companion with a soft whine of greeting. "Morning, boy," Michael said, beginning the familiar process of transferring from bed to wheelchair. "Looks like the storm's passed." From the kitchen came the sounds of Deputy Kurtz preparing breakfast, accompanied by the clicking of Jackson's nails on the hardwood floor as the retired bomb detection Labrador followed her movements. The domestic normalcy of the scene struck Michael with unexpected force. How long had it been since he'd shared morning routines with another person? The isolation he'd chosen after his injury suddenly seemed less like dignified self-reliance and more like unnecessary deprivation. "Perfect timing," Kurtz called as Michael wheeled into the kitchen, Sentinel padding alongside. "Coffee's fresh and eggs are almost ready." As they ate, Kurtz outlined her plan. Her contact, retired K-9 trainer Sergeant Maxwell Barnes, lived about 2 hours away in Riverton. If road conditions permitted, they could meet him by early afternoon. Barnes knows everyone in Wyoming law enforcement, she explained, refilling Michael's coffee cup. More importantly, he's respected enough that people tell him things they wouldn't share with others. If anyone can help us understand what happened at Blackwater County without setting off alarm bells, it's Max. Michael nodded, appreciating the strategic approach. What about my truck? Already handled. Garnier's picked it up at dawn. Miracle. Workers with vehicles. They promised to have it running by this evening, and I've arranged for one of my deputies to drive it down to Riverton once it's fixed. The efficiency of these arrangements, the ease with which Kurtz had mobilized resources and assistance, highlighted another aspect of community that Michael had forgotten during his years of self-imposed isolation: the power of a professional network built on mutual respect and shared purpose. By mid-morning, they were on the road in Kurtz's SUV, specially equipped for transporting K-9s. Sentinel and Jackson rode in separate compartments in the back, both seemingly content with the arrangement. Michael's wheelchair was secured in the cargo space, his medications and essential supplies organized in a duffel bag beside it. As they traveled south toward Riverton, the landscape opened into high plains, occasionally interrupted by dramatic rock formations. Kurtz maintained a steady flow of conversation, updating Michael on developments in K-9 training techniques and regional law enforcement changes since his retirement. It struck Michael how naturally they fell into professional camaraderie despite the years and circumstances that separated their active service. "Can I ask you something personal?" Kurtz said after a lull in the conversation. Michael tensed slightly, bracing for the usual inquiries about his injury or recovery. "Go ahead. Before finding Sentinel, had you worked with any other dogs? Since Kaiser?" The question wasn't what he expected. "No," Michael replied after a moment. "Kaiser died 6 months after my injury. I didn't see the point afterward." Kurtz nodded, eyes remaining on the road. "When Jackson retires from training work, he still helps me with demonstrations. He'll be my last working partner. I've decided to transition to program administration and instructor roles exclusively." She glanced briefly at Michael. "Every handler has a heart dog, the one partnership that defines all others. For me, it was Jackson. For you, Kaiser." "Kaiser was exceptional," Michael acknowledged, memories surfacing of countless training sessions, deployments, and quiet evenings at home with his K-9 partner. "And now there's Sentinel," Kurtz observed. "Not a replacement for Kaiser, but perhaps equally meaningful in a different way." Michael considered this, looking back at the compartment where Sentinel rode, alert and watchful. "We found each other at the right time," he conceded. Kurtz smiled. "That's usually how it works with the good ones." They arrived in Riverton shortly after noon. Sergeant Barnes had suggested meeting at a local diner called the Crossroads, a favorite gathering spot for law enforcement officers both active and retired. The restaurant sat at the edge of town, its weathered exterior belying the warm, well-maintained interior. As Kurtz helped Michael navigate the wheelchair ramp at the entrance, he felt a momentary surge of self-consciousness. This would be his first public appearance in a professional context since his injury. How would Barnes react? Would the other patrons stare? The familiar impulse to retreat, to avoid potential awkwardness or pity, rose within him. Sentinel, sensing his hesitation, pressed closer to his side. The warmth and solid presence of the dog steadied him, reminding Michael of the purpose that had brought them here. This wasn't about him or his comfort. It was about justice for a K-9 officer abandoned by those sworn to protect him. Inside, the diner was busy but not crowded. Kurtz led the way to a corner booth, where a man in his 60s sat watching their approach. Maxwell Barnes had the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades working outdoors in all conditions. His hair had gone completely white, but his posture remained military straight, and his eyes, sharp and assessing, missed nothing as they swept over Michael, Kurtz, and the two dogs. "Rachel," he greeted Kurtz warmly, standing to embrace her. Briefly before turning to Michael, "Captain Donovan, your reputation precedes you." He extended his hand without hesitation, his grip firm and respectful when Michael accepted it. There was no awkwardness, no poorly concealed pity, just the straightforward acknowledgement of one professional to another. "Appreciate you meeting us, Sergeant Barnes," Michael replied. "Max, please. Been retired too long for formalities." Barnes's attention shifted to the dogs. "Jackson, old friend, looking distinguished as always." He bent slightly to greet the Labrador, then turned his expert gaze to Sentinel. Something flickered in Barnes's expression as he took in the German. Shepard's healing wounds, the still visible evidence of neglect beneath his improving coat. "And this must be Sentinel," he said quietly. "May I?" Michael nodded, and Barnes approached Sentinel slowly, allowing the dog to sniff his hand before making any contact. With gentle expertise, he examined what he could see of Sentinel's condition, noting the healing wounds around his neck where the heavy chain had rubbed raw, the still prominent ribs, and the scarred area on his flank. "GSW," Barnes observed, fingers hovering over but not touching the healed bullet wound. "Not properly treated according to the vet," Michael confirmed. Barnes straightened, his expression hardening. "Let's order lunch, and you can tell me everything, beginning to end." Over plates of the diner's signature pot roast, Michael recounted finding Sentinel, the dog's condition, and what they'd learned so far about the changes at Blackwater County's K9 program. Kurtz occasionally added context from her sources, painting a picture of a once-respected unit transformed under new leadership. Barnes listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. When Michael finished, the retired trainer sat back, his weathered face grave. "Unfortunately, it fits with what I've been hearing," he said finally. "Sheriff Preston brought in his own K9 trainer, guy named Victor Schultz, military background like Preston, but rumor has it he was disciplined for excessive force with service dogs. Started implementing controversial training methods at Blackwater, emphasizing absolute compliance over the partnership approach most modern units use." "And the handlers?" Michael asked. "Most quit or transferred. Those who stayed either agreed with the new approach or needed the job badly enough to keep quiet." Barnes tapped his notebook thoughtfully. "But there was one, Marcus Ellington, the previous K9 supervisor who fought back. What happened to him?" "Forced into early retirement about 10 months ago. Official reason was budget cuts, but nobody believed it. Ellington had been there 15 years, built their program from nothing into one of the best small county units in the state." Michael leaned forward. "And Sentinel? Was he Ellington's dog?" Barnes nodded. "That's my understanding. Ellington's second K9. His first retired naturally a few years back. By all accounts, they were an exceptional team, multiple citations for field work." "So why would Ellington abandon his partner?" Michael demanded, anger edging into his voice. "That's the question, isn't it?" Barnes replied evenly, "and why I don't think he did. Everything I know about Marcus Ellington says he'd sooner cut off his own arm than abandon his K9. A tense silence settled over the table as the implication sank in. If Ellington hadn't abandoned Sentinel, then someone else had, likely someone, connected to the new regime at Blackwater County. "We need to talk to Ellington," Michael said finally. Barnes hesitated. "That's where it gets complicated." After his forced retirement, Ellington seemed to vanish, sold his house, changed his number. Word is he moved to Idaho or Montana, but nobody seems to have a current address. Kurtz exchanged a glance with Michael. But you do, she guessed. A slight smile crossed Barnes's face. I might, but before I share that information, I need to be clear about something. If what I suspect happened at Blackwater is true, you're dealing with people who've already demonstrated they're willing to abandon a police K9 to die. People with political connections and the authority of law enforcement. This isn't just about finding answers anymore. It could be dangerous. Michael straightened in his wheelchair, a familiar determination settling over him. I've faced dangerous people before. Not as a civilian, Barnes countered, echoing Kurtz's earlier warning. Not with... He gestured vaguely toward Michael's wheelchair. For the first time since their meeting, Michael felt a flare of the old anger and frustration. This, he said, gripping the arm of his wheelchair, doesn't change who I am or what I'm capable of. Different methods, same determination. Barnes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. But you'll need more than determination. You'll need allies, evidence, and a plan. That's why we're here, Michael replied. Barnes glanced around the diner, then lowered his voice. Not here. My place. It's about 20 minutes outside town, more private for what comes next. As they prepared to leave, Michael noticed something unexpected. Several patrons, clearly law enforcement based on their bearing and the subtle acknowledgement they'd given Barnes, nodded respectfully in his direction. Not pity, not curiosity, but professional recognition. Despite his wheelchair, despite his years away from active duty, they still recognized him as one of their own. The realization sent a surprising wave of emotion through Michael. He had withdrawn from this world, this brotherhood, believing his injury had somehow disqualified him from membership. Yet here they were, acknowledging him without hesitation. Barnes's property proved to be a modest ranch house set on several acres of open land bordered by cottonwood trees. A large outbuilding behind the main house had been converted into a state-of-the-art K9 training facility, complete with various exercise equipment, agility courses, and scent detection stations. Retired but not inactive, Barnes explained as they toured the facility. I consult with departments across 3 states, helping them establish or improve their K9 programs. Proper training, proper handling, it makes all the difference between a successful partnership and a disaster. For the first time since they'd met him, Sentinel showed visible excitement, moving more energetically as they explored the training areas, his nose working constantly, his body language suggesting recognition of a familiar environment. This was his element, the purpose for which he'd been bred and trained. He remembers, Michael observed quietly. Barnes nodded. Muscle memory, scent association, it's all still there. Whatever happened to him physically, they couldn't erase. His training, or his drive. In the main house, Barnes led them to a study lined with bookshelves and filing cabinets. Maps of Wyoming and surrounding states covered one wall, with colored pins marking what appeared to be various K9 units. On another wall hung photographs spanning decades. Barnes with various police dogs at training sessions, ceremonies, and competitions. My war room, Barnes said with a self-deprecating smile. He moved to a filing cabinet, unlocked it with a key from his pocket, and extracted a manila folder. Everything I've gathered about Blackwater County's K9 program over the past 18 months. Changes in personnel, training methods, operational procedures. He spread the contents across his desk. Photographs, news clippings, internal memoranda that had somehow found their way to him, and handwritten notes from conversations with sources. And regarding Marcus Ellington, Barnes added, pulling a small address book from his desk drawer. Last I heard, he was living outside Kalispell, Montana. Bought a small piece of land, keeps to himself. He and I aren't close, but we've respected each other's work for years. Michael studied the address. That's less than 3 hours from my cabin. Coincidence? Kurtz wondered aloud. Or another piece of the puzzle, Barnes replied. Either way, talking to Ellington seems like your next step, but not alone and not without preparation. Over the next hour, they developed a strategy. Barnes would contact trusted former colleagues still active in Wyoming law enforcement, discreetly gathering information about Sheriff Preston and his K-9 trainer Schultz. Hertz would use her position to access certain records without raising alarms. Michael would focus on building a timeline of Sentinel's last known activities with Blackwater County and his subsequent abandonment. "We meet back here in 3 days," Barnes concluded. "By then, your truck should be fixed, and we'll have enough information to approach Ellington safely." As they prepared to leave, Kurtz had arranged lodging for them at a nearby motel that accommodated service animals. Barnes took Michael aside. "One more thing," he said, voice lowered. "I have something that might interest you." He led Michael to a storage room where various K-9 equipment was organized on shelves and hooks. From a locked cabinet, Barnes removed what appeared to be a tactical vest designed for police dogs. The latest model, lighter than the standard issue, with better protection and integrated attachments for cameras or other equipment. He held it out to Michael. "Sentinel's earned this, I think, once he's fully recovered." The offering represented more than just equipment. It was acknowledgement of Sentinel's continued status as a working K-9, despite everything that had happened to him. It was recognition of the new partnership forming between Michael and the German Shepherd. It was, in its way, a blessing from one generation of K-9 handlers to another. "Thank you," Michael said simply, accepting the vest. As they drove to the motel, Sentinel and Jackson again secured in their compartments, Michael reflected on the day's developments. In less than 24 hours, their isolated quest for answers had transformed into something larger, a network of professionals, united by common values and a shared sense of justice. From Deputy Kurtz to Sergeant Barnes to the officers who had nodded respectfully in the diner, Michael had reconnected with a community he'd thought forever closed to him. More significantly, he'd been accepted not with pity or accommodation, but with the straightforward respect of colleagues. His wheelchair had been acknowledged and adapted for without becoming the defining feature of their interactions. He was Captain Donovan again, not despite his injury, but inclusive of it. At the motel, as Michael settled Sentinel in their room, for the night he received a text message from Barnes. "Contacted 3 trusted sources today. All confirmed troubling patterns at Blackwater, but also all asked same question. Is that really you helping with this, Donovan? People remember you. People respect you still. Never forget that." Michael read the message twice, then set his phone aside. Outside the window, stars appeared in the Wyoming sky, brilliantly clear after the storm. Sentinel lay nearby, his breathing, deep and regular, more relaxed than Michael had yet seen him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new information, new decisions. But tonight, Michael Donovan felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. The strength that comes from standing shoulder to shoulder with others who share your values and your fight. He was no longer just a man in a wheelchair with a rescued dog. He was part of something larger, a community of dedicated professionals united in pursuit of justice. And for the first time since bullets had torn through his spine, Michael allowed himself to recognize that perhaps his greatest strength had never been in his legs at all, but in his mind, his determination, and his capacity to inspire others. To join a worthy cause, the next morning arrived with renewed purpose. While Kurtz left early to meet with contacts in the local sheriff's office, Michael remained at the motel, transforming their room into an impromptu investigation center. He arranged the documents Barnes had provided across the small table, sorting them chronologically to establish a timeline of events at Blackwater County. Sentinel observed from his resting place near the window, occasionally rising to stretch or accept gentle scratches behind his ears when Michael needed a moment to process particularly troubling information. The dog's physical improvement continued, steadily, his coat regaining luster, his movements becoming more fluid, his eyes brighter and more engaged with his surroundings. By mid-morning, a disturbing pattern had emerged from Barnes's documentation. Sheriff Preston's takeover of the Blackwater County Department hadn't just affected the K-9 unit. Multiple experienced deputies had resigned or transferred, replaced by officers with military backgrounds similar to Preston's. Civilian complaints about excessive force had increased by 62%, though most were dismissed without thorough investigation. Budget allocations had shifted dramatically from community policing initiatives to tactical equipment and surveillance. In technology, this broader context deepened Michael's concern. What had happened to Sentinel wasn't an isolated incident, but potentially part of a systematic transformation of the department's culture and practices. His phone rang shortly before noon, Kurtz calling with an update. "I've been reviewing incident reports," she said without preamble. "Found something you need to see. Can you meet me at the county records office in 30 minutes? The records building stood downtown, a modest brick structure housing various public documents. Michael navigated his wheelchair through the entrance, Sentinel walking calmly beside him. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced at the dog's service vest, provided by Barnes that morning to facilitate their movements in public spaces. Kurtz waited in a small research room, several file folders spread before her. Her expression was grim, her normally relaxed demeanor replaced by tense focus. "What did you find?" Michael asked, positioning his wheelchair at the table. She pushed a folder toward him. "Blackwater County Incident Report, dated 9 months ago. Rural property check following anonymous noise complaint." Michael opened the file, scanning the carefully typed report. The responding officers had investigated a report of suspicious noises at an isolated property outside the Blackwater County town limits. They reported finding evidence of recent K-9 training activities, but no persons or animals present. The report concluded that the property was likely used for legitimate law enforcement training and recommended no further action. "Look at the address," Kurtz said quietly. Michael checked the location and immediately understood her concern. The property was less than 5 miles from the abandoned Henderson place where he'd found Sentinel. "There's more," Kurtz continued, sliding another document forward. "I pulled property tax records. The land in question is owned by a company called Criterion Security Solutions. Guess who founded that company 3 years ago?" "Victor Schultz," Michael read from the document, recognizing the name of Sheriff Preston's controversial K-9 trainer. "A private security company running operations on rural property near where Sentinel was abandoned," Kurtz summarized. "And there's this." She produced a third document, a heavily redacted incident report from 7 months ago. "Had to call in a favor from a friend in state records to get this. Official vehicle accident report involving a Blackwater County Sheriff's vehicle. The report detailed a minor collision between a county SUV and a private vehicle on a rural road. The sheriff's vehicle had been driven by Deputy James Morrison, transporting department equipment from an authorized training facility back to headquarters. The accident was deemed unavoidable due to ice conditions, with minimal damage to both vehicles. "Again, check the location," Kurtz instructed. Michael did, finding the same general area as the previous report. What was this deputy really transporting? "We can't prove anything yet," Kurtz cautioned, "but the timing aligns with when Sentinel would have disappeared from official duty. And look at the deputy involved. Morrison transferred to Blackwater from the military police the same month Preston became sheriff." Michael sat back, connecting the dots. The picture forming was disturbing. A private training facility run by The sheriff's hand-picked K9 trainer, operating in the same rural area where Sentinel had been abandoned, and a mysterious transport mission around the time the dog would have been removed from service. They were using the private facility for something they couldn't do at the official training center, Michael theorized aloud. Something they didn't want documented or witnessed. Exactly what I'm thinking, Kurtz agreed. Barnes mentioned that Schultz had been disciplined for his methods in the military. Maybe he's implementing those same controversial techniques privately, away from oversight. And Sentinel, Michael asked, though he already feared the answer. If he resisted their methods or couldn't be reprogrammed to their standards. Kurtz let the implication hang in the air between them. They tried to dispose of him, Michael finished, anger edging his voice. Not by euthanasia, which would require documentation, but by abandonment. Sentinel, sensing the tension, moved. Closer to Michael's chair, pressing against his leg in what had become his habitual gesture of support. Michael placed his hand on the dog's head, drawing strength from the connection that had formed between them through mutual need and growing trust. We need to find out exactly what happened at that facility, Michael said firmly. That's where it gets complicated, Kurtz replied. The property is private, likely secured. We can't just drive up and start asking questions without alerting Preston and his people that we're investigating. Michael considered this obstacle. Before his injury, he would have leveraged his position as a police captain to gain access or information. Now, operating as a private citizen with limited mobility, different approaches were required. What about satellite imagery? He suggested. Property that size, any significant structures or training areas would be visible. Kurtz nodded. Good thinking. Let me see what's publicly available. While Kurtz used the records office computer to access mapping databases, Michael continued reviewing the documents, looking for additional connections. One name appeared repeatedly in the reports associated with the K9 program, Deputy Lauren Chen, listed as Schultz's assistant trainer. Unlike most of Preston's new hires, Chen had been with the department before the change in leadership. We should find out more about Deputy Chen, Michael noted. Someone who bridged both versions of the program might have insights about what really happened to Sentinel. By late afternoon, they had assembled a more complete picture. Satellite images showed the Criterion security property contained several structures, a main building, what appeared to be kennels, and various training obstacles arranged in an expansive field. More concerning were indications of recently disturbed earth in a remote corner of the property, far from the main facilities. Could be nothing, Kurtz said, studying the images. Could be something they wanted buried. The implication hung heavy between them. If Sentinel had been deemed a failure in their program, how many other dogs might have met worse fates? As they were preparing to leave the records office, Michael's phone rang, Barnes calling with his own update. Found someone who might talk, he said without preamble. Deputy who transferred out of Blackwater 6 months ago. She's worried about retaliation, but agreed to meet tonight. 8 o'clock, my place. Kurtz drove them back to Barnes's ranch, just outside Riverton, stopping to pick up dinner along the way. By the time they arrived, dusk had settled over the landscape, transforming the training facility behind Barnes's house into shadowy silhouettes against the darkening sky. Barnes met them at the door, his expression both cautious and determined. She's nervous, he warned in a low voice. Handle her carefully. The woman waiting in Barnes' living room appeared to be in her mid-30s, with the alert posture and watchful eyes of a veteran officer. She wore civilian clothes, jeans and a practical sweater, but the badge-shaped impression on her belt revealed where her service weapon would normally be carried. Captain Donovan, Deputy Kurtz, this is Maria Vasquez, Barnes introduced. She served with Blackwater County for 7 years before transferring to Fremont County 6 months ago. Vasquez nodded to them both, her gaze lingering briefly on Michael's wheelchair before shifting to Sentinel. Something flickered across her features. Recognition, perhaps, or concern. "That's one of their dogs," she said quietly. "This is Sentinel," Michael confirmed. "I found him chained and abandoned in an empty building near my property in Montana, left to die." Vasquez's jaw tightened. "I was afraid of that," she murmured almost to herself. "What can you tell us about what happened at Blackwater County?" Michael asked directly. Vasquez hesitated, clearly weighing her words carefully. "I need assurances that my involvement remains confidential. Sheriff Preston has connections throughout the state. If he learns I'm talking—" "We understand," Kurtz assured her. "Our investigation is discreet, and your name won't appear in any documentation." After another moment of consideration, Vasquez nodded. Things changed when Preston took over. The entire culture of the department shifted overnight. Less community service, more paramilitary approach. The K-9 unit was hit hardest. "Because of Schultz," Michael prompted. "Partly," Vasquez confirmed. "He brought extreme training methods, punishment-based, emphasizing absolute control rather than partnership, but it was deeper than that. Preston and Schultz seemed to view the dogs as equipment rather than officers, tools to be used and discarded if they didn't perform exactly as expected." "And Ellington fought back," Michael said, recalling Barnes's information. "Marcus tried." Vasquez agreed, sadness evident in her tone. "He argued against the new methods, documented injuries to the dogs, filed complaints up the chain, but Preston had political protection at the county level. Eventually they forced Marcus out, threatened to investigate him for misuse of department resources if he didn't retire quietly." "What about Sentinel?" Kurtz asked. "He was Ellington's partner, correct?" Vasquez's expression darkened. "Yes. After Marcus was gone, they reassigned Sentinel to Deputy Morrison, one of Preston's new hires with military K-9 experience. Morrison tried to retrain him using Schultz's methods." She paused, her hands tightening into fists momentarily. Sentinel resisted. He'd been trained properly by Marcus, based on trust and positive reinforcement. He couldn't adapt to their approach. "What happened then?" Michael pressed, though he suspected the answer. "They labeled him untrainable and aggressive." Vasquez replied, disgust evident in her voice. "Standard procedure would be humane euthanasia with documentation or placement with a qualified handler. But one day, Sentinel simply disappeared from the program. When I asked about him, Schultz said he'd been appropriately disposed of." The clinical coldness of the phrase hung in the air, a stark contrast to the living, breathing dog who now pressed reassuringly against Michael's wheelchair. "Did you believe him?" Michael asked. Vasquez met his gaze directly. "No, that's partly why I transferred. Too many things happening that violated everything I believe about proper policing and K-9 handling." She hesitated again, then added, "There were rumors about the Criterion facility, dogs that didn't meet their standards being used for stress testing of other K-9s. Stress testing?" Kurtz repeated, frowning. "Using them as aggression targets," Barnes explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "It's a prohibited practice in legitimate programs because it often results in severe injury or death." "To the target, dog." Michael's hand moved protectively to Sentinel's head. The dog looked up at him, amber eyes calm and trusting, seemingly unaware of the horrific possibilities being discussed. "If that's true," Michael said finally, "it's not just unethical, it's criminal animal abuse. Which is why they do it. At a private facility, off-county property, with no official documentation," Kurtz added. "I don't have proof," Vasquez acknowledged. "Just things I overheard, patterns I noticed. But if you found Sentinel alive—" She studied the German shepherd. He must have escaped somehow, or someone helped him. The conversation continued for another hour, with Vasquez providing additional details about department operations, personnel, and the locations of both official and unofficial training sites. By the time she left, departing separately and taking a circuitous route home as a precaution, they had enough information to form a more complete picture of the situation. "This goes beyond one dog," Barnes observed grimly after showing Vasquez. "Out. Preston and Schultz have systematically dismantled a respected canine program and replaced it with something that violates every standard of proper handling and care. And they've covered it up effectively," Kurtz added. "Without hard evidence or witnesses willing to go on record, it's their word against suspicions." "Sentinel is the evidence," Michael said quietly, his hand still resting on the dog's head. "His condition, his location when found, the untreated gunshot wound, it all corroborates Vasquez's account. But it's not enough for official action," Barnes cautioned, "not against a sheriff with political protection." Michael considered this, the investigator in him automatically assessing approaches and angles. "Then we need more, and I think Marcus Ellington might be the key." "You still plan to find him?" Kurtz asked. "More than ever," Michael confirmed. "If Sentinel escaped or was helped to escape, Ellington is the most likely person responsible. He would have tracked his partner, tried to protect him. That's assuming Ellington even knew what happened after he was forced out," Barnes noted. "He knew," Michael said with certainty. "A handler always knows." That night, after returning to the motel, Michael lay awake reviewing everything they'd learned. The scope of their investigation had expanded significantly, from simply understanding Sentinel's past to potentially exposing systematic abuse within a county law enforcement agency. The stakes were higher, the obstacles greater, the potential for resistance more significant. Yet despite these complications, Michael felt more energized than he had in years. Each new piece of information, each connection made, each ally found rekindled aspects of himself he had thought permanently extinguished by his injury. The investigator, the advocate, the leader. Sentinel slept nearby, his breathing deep and regular, occasionally punctuated by the soft twitches of dreaming. Looking at him, Michael made a silent promise. They would find Ellington, they would document what had happened at Blackwater County, and they would ensure that Preston and Schultz faced consequences for their actions. This mission had become about more than one abandoned dog. It had become about justice, accountability, and the sacred trust between handlers and their canine partners, a trust that transcended badges, departments, and even the line between human and canine. As sleep finally claimed him, Michael's last conscious thought was that perhaps in the most unexpected way, his grievous injury had led him exactly where he needed to be, not as a police captain with a badge and authority, but as a civilian with the freedom to pursue justice by unconventional means. Guided by a dog who had survived the worst of human betrayal, yet still found the capacity to trust again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in 3 years, Michael Donovan faced the future, not with resignation, but with purpose. A purpose forged in shared suffering and mutual redemption. The crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Michael's repaired truck the following morning. As promised, one of Deputy Kurtz's officers had driven it down from the garage where it had been fixed, arriving just as Michael and Sentinel were completing their morning medication and care routine. "Good as new, sir," the young officer said, handing over the keys. "Mr. Garnier said they reinforced the undercarriage while they were at it. Said something about Montana back roads being meaner than a hungry grizzly." Michael thanked the officer and inspected the vehicle. Indeed, the repairs were impeccable, with no evidence of the ditch incident visible. His adaptive controls had been carefully preserved, and the specialized wheelchair mounting system remained perfectly calibrated. The attention to detail spoke of true craftsmanship rather than mere mechanical repair. "We'll head back to Barnes's place," Michael told Kurtz after the officer departed. "Based on what Vasquez told us, I want to refine our approach before we try to locate Ellington." The morning passed in focused activity, with Michael, Kurtz and Barnes gathered around the latter's dining table, maps and documents spread across its surface. Sentinel and Jackson had settled in the adjoining room, both dogs seemingly content in each other's professional company. "If we're right about what happened," Michael said, tracing a route on the map between Blackwater County and the Montana, a border, Sentinel was either abandoned at the Henderson place deliberately or managed to escape and made his way there by chance. "The Henderson property is approximately 180 miles from the Criterion facility," Barnes noted, measuring the distance with his fingers. "No way Sentinel traveled that far in his condition, especially in winter." "Which means someone transported him," Kurtz concluded, "either to dispose of him somewhere remote or to help him escape," Michael finished. "Someone who knew that area, who might have connections there." They all understood the implication. Ellington may have orchestrated Sentinel's extraction from Blackwater County, taking him as far away as possible from Preston and Schultz's influence. But why leave him chained in an abandoned building? Kurtz wondered. If Ellington rescued him, why not take him all the way? Michael had been contemplating this question since their meeting with Vasquez. Maybe something went wrong. Ellington was under surveillance, or the weather turned bad, or he became ill. Maybe he planned to return but couldn't. Or maybe it wasn't Ellington at all, Barnes suggested. Could have been another sympathetic deputy, someone still inside. The department who couldn't openly oppose Preston but couldn't stomach what was happening either. The possibilities multiplied, each with its own implications for their investigation. By noon, they had developed a comprehensive strategy. Michael and Sentinel would continue to Kalispell to locate Ellington, while Kurtz would return to her jurisdiction to pursue official channels for information about Blackwater County operations. Barnes would activate his network of contacts to gather additional intelligence and prepare for potential legal actions. This has become bigger than finding answers about one dog, Barnes observed as they concluded their planning session. We're looking at potential systematic abuse of K-9 officers, misuse of county resources, and cover-ups by elected officials. Michael nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What had begun as a personal mission to understand Sentinel's past had evolved into something with potential implications for K-9 programs throughout the region. If Preston and Schultz were implementing abusive training methods and disposing of dogs that failed to meet their standards, the precedent could spread to other departments seeking quick results regardless of ethical considerations. We need to document everything, Michael emphasized. Photographs, medical records, witness statements, anything that establishes a pattern of misconduct rather than isolated incidents. I've been thinking about that, Kurtz said, reaching for her notebook. What if we approach this more systematically? Create a database of K-9 officers in departments where Preston or Schultz have influence, track transfers, retirements, and replacements. Follow the dogs, Barnes agreed, nodding. Smart approach. I can help with that. I still train with about a dozen departments in 3 states. They broke for lunch, which Barnes prepared in his well-equipped kitchen. As they ate, Michael found himself studying the photographs that lined the retired trainer's walls, images spanning decades of K-9 work, training sessions, graduations, award ceremonies. The evolution of equipment and techniques was visible across the chronology, but what remained constant was the evident bond between handlers and their dogs. You've dedicated your life to this, Michael observed, gesturing toward the visual history. Barnes followed his gaze, expression softening. Started as a patrol officer, never intending to work with dogs. Then a canine team saved my life during a warehouse search gone bad. After that, well, you know how it is. Once you understand what these partnerships can accomplish, nothing else compares. Michael did know. His years with Kaiser had been the most fulfilling of his career, their connection transcending simple working partnership to become something approaching telepathic communication. That bond had been one of his most painful losses after the shooting. Not just his mobility, but the daily rhythm of working alongside a being so perfectly attuned to his thoughts and intentions. Looking at Sentinel now, calmly observing their conversation from his place near Michael's chair, he recognized that while nothing could replace Kaiser, something equally meaningful had begun to form between himself and this new dog. A connection, born not from training protocols and service requirements, but from mutual need and growing trust. "I've been meaning to ask," Michael said, turning back to Barnes. "These databases you're creating, is there a broader purpose beyond our immediate investigation?" Barnes set down his fork, expression growing more serious. "I believe what we're seeing at Blackwater County isn't isolated. There's a concerning trend in some departments toward viewing K9s as tactical equipment rather than officers, tools to be optimized for performance without regard for their welfare or the ethical implications of certain training methods." "Military influence?" Kurt suggested. "Partly," Barnes acknowledged. "Some handlers returning from overseas deployments bring techniques that prioritize immediate compliance over bond building. But it's also budgetary. Administrators wanting faster results, quicker deployments, less investment in the relationship aspects of training. Counterproductive," Michael noted. "The bond is what makes K9 teams effective." "Exactly," Barnes agreed emphatically. "But proving that takes time and proper documentation, which is where you come in, Captain." Michael raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Your experience as both a decorated canine handler and now as someone working with a dog who survived abusive methods gives you a unique perspective," Barnes explained. "If we can establish what happened at Blackwater County and create protocols for identifying similar situations elsewhere, you could become an important advocate for proper canine program standards." The suggestion caught Michael off guard. He had been focused on Sentinel's specific situation, not considering broader implications or his potential role in addressing them. The idea of becoming an advocate, of speaking publicly, testifying, if necessary, using his experience to influence policy, seemed far removed from the isolated life he'd constructed since his injury. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," he said carefully. "Who better?" Barnes countered. "You understand both sides of this issue intimately. Your reputation in law enforcement remains strong, and critically, you have nothing to lose. Professionally, Preston and his allies can't threaten your job or pension. And you have something they don't," Kurtz added quietly. "What's that?" Michael asked. "Moral authority," she replied simply. "You found an abandoned canine and dedicated yourself to seeking justice for him despite your own challenges. That story resonates, especially within the law enforcement community." Michael absorbed their words, conflicted about the path they suggested. For 3 years, he had deliberately withdrawn from public life, avoiding exactly the kind of visibility and engagement they now proposed. Yet he couldn't deny the logic of their argument or the pull of purpose he'd begun to feel since finding Sentinel. "One step at a time," he said finally. "First we find Ellington and get his account of what happened. Then we evaluate our options based on what we learn." They finished lunch and began final preparations for their separate missions. Kurtz would depart immediately for her jurisdiction, where she could access official channels without raising suspicion. Barnes would remain in Riverton, coordinating information and reaching out to contacts. Michael and Sentinel would head north toward Kalispell the following morning, hoping to locate Marcus Ellington and piece together the final elements of Sentinel's story. As Michael prepared to leave for the motel where he and Sentinel would spend one more night before beginning their journey, Barnes approached with a small package. "Almost forgot," the retired trainer said. "These might help." Inside the package, Michael found specialized GPS tracking collars, compact enough to be unobtrusive, but sophisticated enough to provide real-time location data over considerable distances. "Military grade," Barnes explained. "Each has a 72-hour battery life when activated and can transmit location data to any paired smartphone. Figured you and Sentinel should have a way to locate each other if you get separated." The practical thoughtfulness of the gift struck Michael deeply. These weren't standard civilian pet trackers, but professional-grade equipment designed for tactical operations, an acknowledgement of the seriousness of their mission and the potential risks involved. "We'll use them wisely," Michael promised, securing one of the devices to Sentinel's service vest. Back at the motel, Michael spent the evening reviewing all they had learned and planning the approach to Kalispell. According to Barnes's information, Ellington had purchased property approximately 30 miles outside the city, remote enough for privacy but not completely isolated. No landline was registered to the address, and no social media accounts appeared under Ellington's name, suggesting someone deliberately maintaining a low profile. Michael contemplated the best approach. Simply driving up to Ellington's property might trigger defensive reactions from a man clearly hiding from his past. A phone call wouldn't work without contact information. Ultimately, Michael decided on a direct but careful approach. He would locate the property, observe from a respectful distance to confirm occupancy, then make contact in a public setting if possible, minimizing any sense of threat or invasion. As he finalized these plans, his phone rang, Kurtz calling with an unexpected development. "I've been making some inquiries using official channels," she said without preamble. "Got an interesting hit from highway patrol dispatch logs from 7 months ago, about when Sentinel would have disappeared from Blackwater County." "What kind of hit?" Michael asked, immediately alert. "Welfare check called in by a passing motorist. Vehicle parked on the shoulder of Highway 287 near the Montana-Wyoming border appeared to be having mechanical trouble. Officer responded, but found no one with the vehicle, a dark blue Jeep Cherokee registered to Marcus Ellington." Michael sat straighter, mind racing with implications. The vehicle was abandoned? Temporarily, it seems. By the time a tow truck arrived, someone had returned to the vehicle and declined assistance. The responding officer noted that the driver appeared agitated but not impaired, and had a large dog with him. "Sentinel," Michael said softly, glancing at the German shepherd now dozing on the motel room floor. "Timeline and location fit," Kurtz agreed. "That stretch of highway is about 40 miles from the Henderson property." "So Ellington was transporting Sentinel out of Wyoming," Michael theorized, "had vehicle trouble near the border, and something happened that prevented him from completing the journey. Or forced him to change plans," Kurtz suggested. The patrol officer noted that a sheriff's department vehicle passed through the same area shortly before he arrived. Couldn't confirm which county, but if it was Blackwater, Ellington might have feared being discovered, Michael finished. He could have hidden temporarily, then changed his route to avoid detection, perhaps leaving Sentinel at the Henderson place as a temporary measure while he established a more secure location. "Planning to return later," Kurtz concluded. "But he never did," Michael said grimly, the pieces falling into place, "which means something prevented him, arrest, injury, or worse." The conversation ended with renewed urgency for the next day's journey. If Ellington had indeed rescued Sentinel only to be prevented from completing their escape, he might be in danger himself, or worse, already silenced by those determined to cover up what had happened at Blackwater County. That night, preparing for sleep, Michael found himself contemplating the expanding scope of their mission. What had begun as a simple quest to understand one dog's past had evolved into an investigation with potential implications for canine programs region-wide. And now, there was the suggestion that he, Michael Donovan, might have a role to play beyond this specific case, as an advocate, a voice for reform, a defender of the sacred partnership between handlers and their canine officers. It was a future he couldn't have imagined 3 years ago, when a bullet had torn through his spine and seemed to end his life's purpose. Yet here he was, planning investigations, gathering evidence, forming alliances, not despite his wheelchair, but with it integrated into his approach and methods. As Sentinel shifted in his sleep, paws twitching slightly as he chased something in his dreams, Michael realized that their parallel journeys of recovery had expanded beyond personal healing. They had found in each other not just companionship, but purpose, a shared mission that might ultimately protect other handlers and canines from experiencing the traumas they had each endured. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they ventured north in search of Marcus Ellington. But for the first time in years, Michael Donovan looked toward the future with something approaching optimism, not because he expected an easy path, but because he had rediscovered what it meant to pursue something larger than himself, to apply his skills and experience toward justice that transcended personal concerns. In seeking to save Sentinel, he was finding parts of himself long thought lost. And in the process, both man and dog were discovering a vision of purpose that extended far beyond the boundaries of their initial connection. A vision of advocacy, reform, and protection for the unique bond that tied human and canine officers together in service. Dawn broke with crystalline clarity over the Wyoming landscape as Michael and Sentinel prepared for their journey north. The temperature had dropped overnight, coating the world in a thin layer of frost that glittered under the rising sun. Michael loaded their supplies methodically: medications, food, emergency equipment, and the specialized tracking devices Barnes had provided. Each item found its designated place in the adapted truck, the process comfortingly familiar from his years organizing patrol vehicles for efficient deployment. Sentinel watched from nearby, his posture more confident than even a few days earlier. The dog's physical recovery continued steadily, with increased energy and improved muscle tone visible beneath his gradually thickening coat. More striking was his psychological transformation. The wary, traumatized animal Michael had found chained in the abandoned garage had given way to an increasingly alert, engaged canine who maintained professional awareness of his surroundings while remaining attentive to Michael's movements and needs. "Ready for a road trip, partner?" Michael asked, securing the last of their supplies. Sentinel responded with a soft whine of affirmation, moving to his customary position beside the passenger door. Michael smiled slightly at the dog's evident eagerness, another positive sign of his recovery. As Michael transferred from wheelchair to driver's seat, his phone chimed with an incoming message from Barnes. "Contact in Kalispell confirms Ellington still at same property. Maintains very low profile. Proceed with caution. He's reportedly hypervigilant about unexpected visitors." The warning reinforced Michael's decision to approach carefully. A former canine handler living in isolation after forced retirement would likely have security measures in place and might react defensively to unannounced arrivals. Their initial contact would need to be handled with particular sensitivity. The journey north unfolded under clear skies, the truck's heating system keeping the interior comfortable despite the dropping temperatures outside. Michael and Sentinel settled into an easy rhythm of driving, punctuated by regular stops for medication, stretching, and brief walks to maintain the dog's improving mobility. They crossed into Montana shortly after noon, the landscape gradually shifting from Wyoming's open plains to more rugged, forested terrain. Michael felt a complex mix of emotions as they passed the turnoff that would have led back to his cabin near White Ridge. A strange homesickness mingled with the certainty that returning now, before completing their mission, was unthinkable. How quickly priorities could change. 3 weeks ago, his world had been defined by the boundaries of his property, his days structured around basic survival and minimal interaction with others. Now he found himself crossing state lines, coordinating a multi-person investigation, and contemplating a future role as an advocate for canine program reform, all because of a whimper heard through a winter storm. They stopped for an early dinner at a roadside diner about 50 miles south of Kalispell. The establishment was quiet, with only a few other patrons scattered among the booths. Michael selected a table with good visibility of both entrances, an old habit from his law enforcement days that had never faded. Sentinel settled beneath the table, positioning himself where he could observe the room while remaining unobtrusive. As they waited for their food, Michael reviewed the information Barnes had provided about Ellington's property. Located in a sparsely populated area east of Kalispell, the 5-acre parcel contained a modest cabin and several outbuildings, all positioned to maximize privacy from the infrequently used county road that provided access. Satellite imagery showed dense forest surrounding 3 sides of the cleared area where the structures stood, with a single driveway connecting to the public road. The waitress had just delivered Michael's meal when his phone vibrated with an incoming call from Kurtz. "We may have a problem," she said without preamble, her voice tight with controlled tension. "I've been monitoring Blackwater County radio traffic through official channels, and about 30 minutes ago there was a coded transmission about an administrative review team being dispatched to an undisclosed location in Montana." Michael's instincts immediately sharpened. Preston's people, almost certainly. The transmission came directly from their headquarters frequency, and the response included a vehicle identifier registered to Victor Schultz. "They know we're investigating," Michael concluded, mind racing through implications. "Someone tipped them off." "Possibly," Kurtz agreed, "or they've been monitoring communications related to Ellington and picked up Barnes's inquiries." "How far ahead of us are they?" "Can't be sure, but based on the timing of the transmission, I'd estimate at least a 2-hour head start." Michael processed this information rapidly, considering options and risks. If Preston's team reached Ellington first, they could intimidate him into silence, destroy evidence, or worse. The retired handler might have no warning of their approach, especially if he was deliberately maintaining isolation from his former department. "I need to get to Ellington before they do," Michael said decisively. "Can you alert Barnes and have him try to warn Ellington directly?" "Already on it," Kurtz replied, "but he hasn't had any success with the contact number he has. Might be turned off or out of service." Michael thanked her for the warning and ended the call, immediately signaling for the check. As he paid, he noticed a county sheriff's deputy entering the diner, standard dinner stop. Nothing unusual in the officer's demeanor, but Michael's heightened awareness registered every detail of the uniform, equipment, and vehicle visible through the window. Outside, Michael transferred quickly to the driver's seat, stowing his wheelchair with practiced efficiency. Sentinel jumped into the passenger seat without prompting, seemingly attuned to the sudden urgency. As Michael started the engine, he noticed the deputy watching them from inside the diner, speaking into his radio while maintaining visual contact with the truck. "Could be nothing," Michael told Sentinel as they pulled onto the highway. "Or could be exactly what we're worried about." He maintained precisely the speed limit as they continued north, not wanting to give any legitimate reason for being stopped. In the passenger seat, Sentinel remained alert, occasionally glancing back as if checking for pursuit. 20 minutes later, Michael's vigilance was rewarded when he spotted a dark SUV with Wyoming plates, several vehicles behind them. The vehicle wasn't using emergency lights or making obvious attempts to close the distance, but its presence, hundreds of miles from its home jurisdiction, confirmed Kurtz's warning. "We've got company," Michael murmured to Sentinel. He considered options. Direct confrontation was unwise. If these were indeed Preston's people, they had legal authority and weapons, while Michael was a civilian with limited mobility. Attempting to outrun them would be equally foolish, potentially resulting in dangerous pursuit or legitimate charges. The most prudent approach was to reach Ellington without leading Preston's team directly to his doorstep. Michael took the next exit, a rural route that wouldn't take them toward Ellington's property, but would reveal whether the Wyoming vehicle was actually following them. The SUV also exited, maintaining the same careful distance. Confirmation achieved. Michael now needed to create separation without appearing to evade law enforcement. He pulled into a gas station, parking near the convenience store entrance. The Wyoming SUV drove past slowly, then turned around in a nearby lot, positioning to maintain surveillance while remaining inconspicuous. 2 men occupied the vehicle. One, matching Victor Schultz's description from Barnes's photos. The other unfamiliar but with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. "Time for a strategic decision," Michael told Sentinel, who watched him with intense focus. Inside the convenience store, Michael purchased coffee and asked the clerk for directions to a local campground, speaking loudly enough to be overheard by anyone listening. He then made a show of studying a map spread on the hood of his truck, before departing in the direction of the fictional camping destination, opposite from Ellington's actual location. The Wyoming SUV followed at a discreet distance, exactly as Michael had anticipated. He drove unhurriedly along increasingly rural roads, leading their surveillance team progressively away from their actual objective. After 15 minutes, when they were thoroughly committed to the false trail, Michael executed the key element of his plan. He pulled into a small roadside park where several hiking trails led into the surrounding forest. The spot was perfect, multiple vehicles already parked, several groups of hikers visible, and critically, a ranger station with staff present. Michael positioned his truck prominently, ensuring the Wyoming observers would have clear visibility of his apparent intentions. With deliberate movements, he transferred into his wheelchair and retrieved a small backpack, making a show of checking its contents while sentinels stood attentively beside him. Then they approached the ranger station, where Michael engaged the uniformed ranger in animated conversation, gesturing toward one of the shorter trails as if asking for information. From their vantage point, the Wyoming team would see a man in a wheelchair, clearly planning a brief excursion on an accessible trail with his service dog, a scenario that would keep them stationary, waiting for his return, since they couldn't follow on foot without revealing their surveillance. What they couldn't see was Michael showing the ranger his former police captain's credentials, still carried out of habit, and explaining that he needed assistance with a sensitive matter involving potential harassment. The ranger, recognizing legitimate law enforcement identification and responding to Michael's professional demeanor, agreed to help. 5 minutes later, a park service truck departed from the rear of the ranger station via a service road not visible from the main parking area. In the passenger seat sat Michael, his wheelchair secured in the back, with Sentinel positioned between them. The ranger had agreed to transport them to the main highway several miles away, where a colleague would meet them with a second vehicle, for the final leg to Ellington's property. "Retired officer helping another," the ranger said simply when Michael thanked him. "Besides, something seemed off about those guys in the Wyoming vehicle, too interested in your movements for comfort." The ranger's colleague arrived promptly at the highway rendezvous, a Forest Service biologist heading home after fieldwork, happy to provide transportation to within walking distance of Ellington's property. By the time Preston's team realized they'd been outmaneuvered, Michael and Sentinel would have at least a 30-minute head start. As they approached the turnoff nearest Ellington's land, darkness was falling, adding another layer to their tactical advantage. Michael's companion stopped his truck on a Forest Service access road approximately half a mile from their destination. "This is as close as I can get you," the biologist apologized. "Private property starts just beyond that ridge." "It's perfect," Michael assured him. "We can manage from here." The situation presented an obvious challenge, half a mile of rugged terrain in near darkness. With Michael's mobility limited to his wheelchair, the all-terrain model could handle moderate obstacles, but progress would be slow and potentially noisy. "I need you to scout ahead," Michael told Sentinel, securing one of Barnes's tracking devices to the dog's vest. "Find Ellington." He held out a training aid Barnes had provided, a small pouch containing fabric with Ellington's scent, obtained from departmental records the retired trainer still had access to. Sentinel sniffed it thoroughly, head tilted in concentration. "Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."